So, Veterans Day this year, Pope Francis dismissed Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, from his diocese. A few days prior to this, Francis had requested the Bishop Strickland resign, and apparently Strickland did not comply. Um, Strickland's diocese had been subject to an apostolic visitation since June of this year, where his diocese was being investigated. That visitation came after Strickland had become a somewhat reserved but vocal critic of Francis for the past 5 or so years. Um, this investigation was justified because of alleged minor problems with the handling of the financial resources of the diocese, and then it was to everybody knows this to justify the clear and imminent dismissal of the bishop. And before returning to this event and how I want to discuss it, I want to get some things out of the way first. I try not to follow news within the church as a deliberate, I guess, like personal policy for my own sanity. Um, I just try to go to Mass and have a private prayer life, have a private devotional life, and I like to learn about church history, scripture, and theology apart from any kind of news. And the reason for that is that following the news of the church and the scandals in Francis's papacy are corrosive to my faith. A lot of the news sites that do this, stuff like LifeSite News, 1 Peter 5, Church Militant, and most infamously, Novus Ordo Watch, they're fear porn. They basically consume your attention, and they tell you that any second, Francis is right on the verge of turning the Catholic Church into, like, the United Church of Christ. Just snap it of his fingers, it's going to turn into the United Church of Christ. We're going to have women priests and bishops. We're going to have gay marriage. We're going to have a clown mass in every parish. We're going to, say that every universal salvation, the whole 9 yards, right? Belief in the real presence is optional. That's what these kind of news sites, they have you over a gun barrel telling you over and over again that that's what's right around the corner. And it's going to undermine your faith, and it scares you into just keep watching their website, just keep sitting there under the fear that it's all going to be over in a second, that Christ was a liar, right? And they did that most recently with the synod of synodality, where they're saying that it was going to approve female priests and bishops and deacons and so on. And we know that that didn't happen. And we know that how many synods they say that that's going to happen, how many times they say it's right on the verge of this great apostasy happening and the church defecting, and that it doesn't, the less and less credibility that they have. But they keep at it anyways. Anyway, the Novus Ordo Watch in particular, they know what they're doing when they do this. They know that they depend upon fear porn, because what they're doing is they're using fear porn to blackpill people deliberately into being sedevacantist. The whole kind of infrastructure of the Catholic news site, I think, is generally toxic at this point and makes everything out to be much worse than it really is. And as if things weren't already bad enough. I just don't think in general, though, that I'm a particularly good candidate to talk about the church and to just present Catholicism to the faithful and the non-faithful in general. And so on Twitter, under SerpCurp, I share Catholic stuff and I make comments about things I'm interested within Christianity and Catholicism. But on my YouTube channel, I generally don't want to comment on my religion. The reason is that, I'm a sinner. And I don't think I'm a good enough person. I don't think I'm a good example to put myself up there and suggest that other people live like me. The second reason is that I believe God will hold me responsible for any errors or anything wrong or anything that's scandalous that could lead people astray. And the bar of making mistakes in that arena is so much more higher than any other subject that I discuss because it's people's eternal souls. Thirdly, I think that a lot of things that I do on the channel, and that I do in general, are scandalous. Not that it's necessarily sinful in and of themselves, but scrupulous people are not going to like it. I'm just going to be frank. I'm a pretty eccentric person, and I've been interested in eccentric things. I love horror media. I like heavy metal. I love heavy metal. I stream video games, and when I stream, I use foul language. I don't necessarily want to use a lot of it, but sometimes it just comes out of me. Uh, I did those flag videos. I was Nazbol gang, right? I'm sympathetic to fascist and communist regimes and causes. I don't necessarily endorse everything that they believe, but I tend to view them in a very neutral fashion compared to the rest of almost everyone you'll meet. So I just don't think that I'm qualified. I think that it's just not. I'm not going to add that much, and I'm going to possibly hurt people's souls if I try to. But on all of this, and with my history of being eccentric, I think that history of being eccentric makes me uniquely qualified to talk about one topic, and that is the history and culture within traditional Catholicism as a movement, because I spent over a year as a sedevacantist. I went through a period of being a sedevacantist. I attended sedevacantist church for months. I spent a lot of time online on message boards like Fish Eaters, Catholic Info, and even the Christian board on 8chan. I generally have a lot of knowledge about sedevacantism and the broadly traditional Catholic culture and history that until recently I was really surprised to know how privileged I was to know that knowledge, and that a lot of people do not know the things that I do in that world that's developed since the Second Vatican Council, a kind of parallel church within the church, a catacomb church alongside what we might think of as the main body of the church. I know more than the vast majority of people, probably more than a lot of priests in the Society of St. Pius X, or I just do. I know a lot about it. Now, I generally try to attend the most conservative or reverent Novus Ordo. I don't like those words describing it, that I can. And I'm going to apologize because I'm talking within the point of view of the traditionalist worldview in this. I kind of am forced to use terms like Novus Ordo in referring to the general body of the church following the Second Vatican Council. It's just something that you're going to end up having to do. But if it was available, I would go to the Latin Mass. It's not really available, at least a non-sedevacantist version where I live. I don't have a Fraternity of St. Peter's here. I don't have even the Society of St. Pius X here. All the indult masses have dried up after Traditionis Custodius. And that sort of thing, it's not an option for me anymore. There isn't really any Eastern Catholic masses nearby, so I can't go to any like Ukrainian or Byzantine liturgy either. I've just kind of, because of this experience of the chaos in the liturgy for the past, 55 odd years, I've just generally come to think that personal devotion and your prayer life is ultimately more important than the liturgy you attend on Sunday. Now, I definitely think that the liturgy holds a very special and very important place, and that attending Mass every Sunday is something that you're required to do on pain of mortal sin as a Catholic. But I don't, I'm not going to agree with the Society of St. Pius X. If there's no Latin Mass, you should go to the Novus Ordo. That's my belief. Um, and I think that you should try to find, if that's the case, go to the Novus Ordo Church that has the least grievous liturgical abuses going on. And, perhaps society viewers or a lot of traditionalists that are listening to this video, they'll see that as cope on my part, and if it is, then so be it. I really wasn't that aware of who Bishop Strickland was until he was dismissed. I looked into it after this dismissal, and it seems that what happened is he was voicing sympathy to this position, which is called benevacantism, for lack of a better word. It's a type of sedevacantism. In benevacantism, Francis has lost the papacy due to heresy, or Francis never was pope because Benedict the 16th never actually resigned from the papacy. There was some kind of thing where he was actually the true pope all along until he died recently. And by voicing that, Bishop Strickland is a grave threat to the legitimacy of Francis's papacy. And Francis, in effect, had to act in self-defense by deposing him as bishop. It must be said, even if Francis dismissed Strickland in an irregular or tyrannical manner, Francis has the right to dismiss bishops as he sees fit. Because, he's the successor to St. Peter. Ironically, despite the shock or sympathy that I feel towards Strickland, this type of thing isn't even the top 100 worst things that Francis has ever done throughout his papacy. You got to just look at the ambiguity on if divorced and remarried Catholics are allowed to take communion, and that he says that the death penalty is inadmissible and it's morally wrong. Those two things are infinitely worse than the dismissal of some bishop he didn't like. Laying the smackdown on personal enemies, that's just normal business in the life of the Petrine ministry. While it may be sad and I may not like it, it doesn't undermine the faith. The real problem, the real thing that's scary here, I think, is the flirtation with sedevacantism on the part of Bishop Strickland. That's far more alarming than Francis dismissing him. Sedevacantism, that was the subject of discussion for, people like me, eccentric hillbillies who live in an out-of-the-way place like Montana. Until, very, very recently, under Francis, as his papacy goes on, that was extremely outside the Overton window. Sedevacantism in a world of crackpots LARPing and infighting with each other when they have questionable holy orders. It's the very fringe of the Catholic world before Francis came to power. Now it's a topic of discussion for sitting bishops. The spread of sedevacantism amongst the mainstream church is an explosive threat to its unity. It threatens to cut the very throat of the papacy itself and could completely undermine Francis, and because he's very old, his successor's legitimacy. The traditional form of sedevacantism holds that popes since Vatican II have not been true popes, and thus they basically think that the entire body of the Catholic Church defected under the leadership of these popes since the Second Vatican Council. Most sedevacantists believe that the reforms in the ordinations and consecrations since Vatican II are invalid, meaning that the vast majority of people that call themselves Catholic priests around the world are basically lay people. And that would mean that the Catholic Church basically, save for a handful of chapels, is went extinct. It just poofed in the air without anybody noticing. And there's a second type of sedevacantism, which maybe is more moderate, but it's a much more complex position, because traditional sedevacantism says that, the Pope was a heretic and lay people depose him, and that's it. It's a done deal. This more advanced position is called sedeprivationism. In sedeprivationism, the papacy, in some sense, continues to exist, and therefore the jurisdiction of the papacy continues to exist. Um, and so all these post-Vatican II popes are not fully popes, but they're materially popes, and the jurisdiction and the cardinals they create are valid. Thus, instead of privationism, the papacy could be recovered had cardinals convert, or they elect a real pope, or a post Vatican II pope as some kind of conversion experience to traditional Catholicism. So these forms of sedevacantism are pretty clear cut in whether it's a more complex form of sedeprivationism or the simpler, more vulgar sedevacantism, traditional sedevacantism. They're clear cut in that they say um, the Catholic Church, the main body of the Catholic Church, if you will, save for a few remnants, is basically, no longer there. It just went out of existence, and now it's an heretical church since then, since Vatican II. This new type of sedevacantism, the benevacantism, which is being championed by, Father Altman, Patrick Coffin, that type of sedevacantism is different. They accept popes until Francis were true popes. So, John the 23rd, which some sedevacantists say was a real pope, and some sedevacantists say was not a real pope. For Benevacantists, clearly real pope. Paul VI, clearly real pope. John Paul I, clearly real pope. John Paul II, real pope. Benedict XVI, real pope, right? Kind of muddier on that part. So they kind of base it off this idea that Benedict in some sense must have resigned under duress, or Francis must have cheated in the 2013 conclave. And so Benedict was pope all along, and that Francis never became pope, and he was just fooling people, and he had an illegal papacy or something along those matters. And then maybe some of them believe that Francis, in the traditional sedevacantist way, that Francis became a heretic, and they can just, as lay people or individual renegade priests like Altman, they can just dismiss his papacy um, on their own, right? But that's what Benevacantism is. And for lack of a better name, this type of sedevacantism is called Benevacantism because it recognizes Benedict as the last pope, or maybe partially Francis part way through his papacy, rather than saying that Vatican II is the cutoff. It has that the general body of the church is still the church. It's just being led by Francis, who's a false pope. And it's not as clear cut because with sedevacantism they can say new mass, new religion, old mass, true religion, right? It's not as clear cut, but if you're gonna take this radical position of sedevacantism, Benevacantism has some more advantages, if you will. It has a much broader appeal. It doesn't just appeal to non-traditionalists. It can cross this division that exists between what I would call like the greater Orthodox body of believing Catholics. You could have a conservative Novus Ordo type, or even Orthodox charismatic Catholic. They can believe in it. Bishops and priests, and they're real bishops and priests. That's definitely a good thing. It makes everything a lot better. So it just has this much broader appeal, and it can use John Paul II's infallible declarations against abortion or women priests, and it can use Paul VI's encyclicals that are conservative, like Humanae Vitae, against Francis. And so if this Benevacantism starts gaining more adherents, it could be really explosive, more explosive and dangerous than the traditional sedevacantism. Because traditional sedevacantism, because it's such a small infighting group, it has this pretty big credibility problem. But if you get if you get Benedicantism off the ground with multiple bishops and multiple lots of priests, Sedevacantism from here on, and say that the priests within the Catholic Church are still real priests and real bishops, a lot of those problems of credibility are kind of out the window. Because to the traditional forms of Sedevacantism, they didn't really develop until the new Mass came out. It was a very long road to where you get to like the CMRI and the Society of St. Pius V, and even the Holy Family Monastery. Like there was a long time where a lot of people would have just been going along with Vatican II, before they realized Sedevacantism is true. But with Benevacantism, there are people right there on the dot that said, no, there's something up with Benedict's resignation, or said right then and there Francis is a heretic. And so that gap in credibility is not so much as a problem. And to go back to it, the original Sedevacantism is really plagued with this problem of credibility throughout the entire history of the traditional Catholic movement. And I think that you could say it's really clear cut, right? It has an answer to everything. Something that the SSPX or the refuse and resist kind of thing doesn't. Because, they can just say Catholicism, not Catholicism, right? They can point to the new church and say wildly crazy, or not the new church, the new Mass, and say wildly aggressive and explosive points like it's the abomination of desolation, or this is a great apostasy. And that if you're in the Society of St. Pius X, it's you have to be a lot more cautious and reserved, because you still think Francis or Benedict or John Paul II, they were all real popes. But that clear-cutness, it has massive downsides that create this credibility problem. And I think the biggest one is that no sitting bishop really ever became a Sedevacantist after the council. You could say Archbishop Took, but his exception proves my rule more than if there was no exception. And he makes Sedevacantism's credibility a whole lot worse than it would be otherwise. Because most Sedevacantist holy orders are descending from Archbishop Took, but he never seems to have ever become a Sedevacantist himself. And even worse, when he did issue a statement of Sedevacantism, he just returned back into the Novus Ordo a year later. He died in exile in this Vietnamese. There's a Vietnamese exile monastery in the United States, and he fell in, I think it was Franciscan, and he stayed there for the last year or two of his life and died there, fully reconciled with the regular body of the church. So at best, the best interpretation you could say is he flip-flopped in being a Sedevacantist. But, other interpretations of the end of his life, they get worse from there, because if you aren't that aware of who Archbishop Took was, he was the Archbishop of Hue City in Vietnam. His brother controlled South Vietnam, and so when he went to Vatican II, his brother was toppled and in a coup, and he was effectively exiled in Europe since then. And in Vatican II, he was one of the most liberal bishops. He said some pretty wild stuff like the Mass should be radically revised to the point that East Asians receive the Eucharist with chopsticks. And if you think, how would you consume a wafer with chopsticks, a holy wafer? Perhaps he thought that it should be noodles or something. It's that he was that far out there. He seemed to be pretty indifferent to what we might. He was on a pretty far out, if you read his biography, pretty far out there from what a lot of other prelates, even like somebody like Bishop Barron today would believe at Vatican II. I mean, his biography kind of just says that he was a member of the far right politically, but he was not what you call um, far right at all within the body of the Catholic Church at the time of Vatican II. And because he was in this exile community, he was a very isolated man who was from a foreign culture, who was at the highest level of society. His brother was president, and then he was living in like a single bedroom apartment on charity from local bishops. And so he ends up falling into the he ends up consecrating all these people bishops. He consecrated 5 members of the Palmarian cult, which is a Spanish. I don't want to call them a set of Sedevacantist church. They are related in some sense to Catholic traditionalism, but they're really a cult. They believe that they explicitly worship Mary as God, and a whole list of other grotesque and absurd heresies. But he went out of his way to consecrate their leadership as bishops, from laymen to priests to bishops within, I think, within a single weekend, if not a single night. Then he consecrated 2 independent Catholics, or independent old Catholics, and these are people, independent Catholic bishops or wandering bishops. These are the kind of people which I call streamers. They literally trade Episcopal orders with each other like Pokemon cards or baseball cards, because they believe that because their orders are so free and easy that they trade different rites across orders. They trade, say, the old Catholic rite, which is very easy. I could go in a few weeks here. I could become a bishop, a legitimate bishop, probably. With somebody like Matthew Arnold or the Brazilian Apostolic Church orders, in independent Catholicism. And he was like, and when I say streaming, that means that they receive orders in old Catholic rites. They receive orders within various Eastern rites, within, say, Russian Orthodox ordination or Greek Orthodox language ordination, or a Anglican ordination, or a Coptic or Syriac ordination. They do those rites and receive them from each other. So they effectively stream a whole bunch of orders on top of each other to prove to themselves that they're bishops, because they're so incredulous in what they do. And he consecrated 2 people and was a part of that. So now took orders are running around the world, and there's all these old independent old Catholic bishops running around with took orders. And then at the very end of his life, he consecrated 3 people, 3 Sedevacantists, to the Catholic episcopate. And that's where the majority of old Catholic, or not old Catholic in general orders, but he did do old Catholics, but Sedevacantist holy orders come from. And so that brings up the question, how could such erratic consecrations have happened? Some people think he had dementia. Did people pay him? Was this simony? Or was he an isolated old man? And this was elder abuse. Was this the joke I told Tyrillian? Was it not even simony in the point of views being paid? Was it simony? He was consecrating people because he was in his 80s and he was isolated Vietnamese man that couldn't speak that good of French or English, and he was just giving out these orders, because that was the only way that he could get attention or friendship. And, I'm taking all these talking points from the Society of St. Pius V, but there's no way that the Society of St. Pius V and the Bishop Mendez lines, they're not that much better either. They have problems there too. Bishop Mendez consecrated Bishop Kelly in secret, and it was only revealed years later. And so a lot of, not necessarily because, the CMRI or Bishop Sanborn and the people that follow him, they're not as pointed in the way that the Society of St. Pius V is, but they have lay people that point to that all the time. and say that all the stuff that happened with Took with Mendez, that could be elder abuse, and that could be that he suffered from dementia too. And so let's move on from the problem of the questionable holy orders. The major problem that everybody knows with sedevacantism, as soon as they hear it, is how are they going to get a pope ever again? They don't have any cardinals to elect one. And so there's three solutions to the traditional sedevacantist problem. One is what you might call a conclavism, um, or they get like they form a conclave themselves, possibly out of like what you might call an imperfect council, in the way that the Great Western Schism was trying to resolve multiple popes, and so the various sedes bishops get together and they try to elect a pope from themselves. This kind of like conclavist thing that led to Pius the 13th and Pope Michael, and I believe Pope Michael has a successor now actually. But these two deceased anti-popes, they didn't get any real following. People found Pope Michael pretty hilarious because it was a guy that was elected by a conclave of six, including himself and two of his parents. It's just pretty sad, the whole conclave thing. And because of the infighting between the cities, their various orders or societies, most particularly the Society of St. Pius V and the CMRI, this whole imperfect council thing with a conclave, that's out of the question. So the second is waiting for divine intervention, and I think that's the most common one. Um, and you know, believing that in effect 99% of the church just defected. Um, that's gonna lead you to think this is the end times, and so we shouldn't be surprised when a bunch of sedevacantists think it's the end times because their idea of the episcopacy and what happened to it, it makes sense it would be the end times. Um, and so they think that as part of the end times, the church will be restored in some sense, because the set of that a popular thing is that Saint Peter and Paul will have some kind of visitation on the earth, or apparitions on the earth, which will, in some way, clearly to the body of sedevacantists, appoint one of the bishops or possibly priest and then a bishop to be pope, for the great persecution of the end time. So it's pretty clear who the Catholic Church is, who the good guys are, and that will be part of the end times. And that's a very popular point of view within sedevacantism. And then you have the whole sedeprivationist solution of maybe God will do that. He'll give maybe there'll be a Novus Ordo Pope or a group of cardinals that will come to their senses and believe in radical traditionalism, and then you'll get a pope out of that through conversion or some kind of miraculous revelation from them. And because of those two problems, sedevacantism has a really low credibility, and because of that low credibility, and because of just a lot of eccentric people, I'm eccentric, that it has this really high burnout rate. And so in my example, I just went back to the main body of the Catholic Church. And it seems that this problem of people going back and forth, I guess problem instead of a contest eyes, between the regular Catholic Church and them, that's something it seems to be a big deal, this wandering or roaming Catholic thing. Instead of Roman Catholics, you have roaming Catholics, Catholics that choose their parish based on what's available and will go back and forth depending on what they know is there. So I've seen a bunch of YouTube sermons run, or sermon channels run by SETIs, and there'll be these sermons where the SETIs are SETI bishops, Bishop Sanborn and others, members of the CMRI, will talk to the lay people and extol them very fiercely that they cannot be half in, half out of sedevacantism. They have to break fully from Novus Ordo, and whatever that means, and that could mean that they're reading, the Jerusalem Bible or the New Revised Version, or doing something like the Divine Mercy Chaplet, because remember, they think that that's heresy. But they could be literally going to the Novus Ordo because they might think the Novus Ordo's confession is valid, and they're going to the Sedevacantists because it has the traditional Latin Mass. And so putting those two things together, in my own experience, it seems that a lot of people in city chapels aren't necessarily Sedevacantist. They're basically shopping between parishes, finding which one will fit them best. And over the course of years, it might not be that they're shopping week to week, but over the course of years, they're getting a sense of what's going on in their community, how far they have to drive out to go to a traditional Latin Mass, and they're making a choice, in a sense, shopping between what's available to them in their community or within driving distance of them, or tolerable driving distance. So they'll go to an indult Latin Mass, or an SSPX, or a Reverend Novus Ordo, or a Sedevacantist chapel, or Eastern Rites, depending on their area. Or maybe they like the TLM a lot, and they're going to drive out to see the SSPX 3 hours away a few times a year, and then go to a Reverend Novus Ordo the rest of the time. So that's just kind of a problem, and that leads into this shopping strategy. Is that the reason that people become Sedevacantist has less to do with accepting the theological positions of Sedevacantism, which to me are kind of tenuous and difficult for most lay people, or even pretty well catechized lay people. The reason that they're joining Sedevacantism is out of kind of like an emotional disgust with what's going on in the regular church. They're disgusted with liturgical abuse, extraordinary ministers walking across all over the place in front of the altar and stuff like that, and handing out with their hands to people in communion in the hand, and priests not being very conservative during sermons, or saying stuff like pray for amnesty or something like that. So like liberal theology, and altar girls, and just bad stuff going on in the Novus Ordo. It really, they're reacting to that. They're not reacting to like any very concrete understanding of like Francis did this action, or this statement in Vatican II contradicts this encyclical, and that they're not on equal footing and will be footing, and that it should be resolved. They don't really think in terms of like there's a problem going on now and then it'll be resolved in the future by smart theologians. They're not thinking about that. They're not thinking like, oh, this encyclical of Leo the 13th is contradicting this thing that Paul VI said, so Paul VI is a heretic. It's not like that, right? Even me, like it was, I went on Novus Ordo watch, and I just got scandal, black-pilled Sedevacantism. That's how it went for me, and that's how I think it goes for the vast majority of people that become Sedevacantist. It's not as deep as they're reading side by side, and they're like, this is not true, and this is true, and I can just see, right? That's definitely how I became a Sedevacantist. It was the scandals. And, let's go backwards in time to Sedevacantism. What was one of the biggest scandals among Sedis in their history? The vast majority of CMRI nuns defected to the regular church because Benedict XVI was Pope and he was traditional. Or at least he seemed to be the Pope enough for them to believe he was the Pope. And so when Benedict XVI was the Pope, when he was doing stuff like no Bibles can use Yahweh and Jehovah, they must say the Lord. When he was correcting for all versus many in the translation of the English Novus Ordo Mass, and when he put out Summorum Pontificum, a lot of people, they left Sedevacantism. And that's because Sedevacantism is a drainage pipe that people end up when they're too scandalized by the regular church and what's going on in the liturgy of the regular church. And you'll know this, and part of the reason why sedevacantists online are so toxic is that a lot of people that have a weakness when it comes to scrupulosity, those are the people that tend to be sedevacantist. They just can't deal with the ambiguity of things on equal footing needing to be resolved later with more nuance, right? They can't deal with Francis revoking their Latin Mass, right? How terrible and horrific that is. He seems to have the right to that. That the Novus Ordo is the real true Roman rite, and it is protected actually under Summorum Pontificum because it is, legally speaking, the same Mass as protected by St. Pius V. Um, they're not gonna fall under that. They're not gonna read it like that. They're really just, they're scandalized, and they're going to move to a place which is more comfortable, and let's be honest here, sometimes much more efficacious for them. And so I think the decision to become a sedevacantist is primarily emotional. And you know what? It hurts me and pains me to say this, but at the SSPX, instead of sedevacantist chapels, they can be more efficacious to these people in their personal lives. And going back on this whole emotional thing, I had this correspondence with Father Shikata, the late Father Shikata. And I told him how I had this really difficult thing of trying to say, does the Vatican II documents really contradict the pre-Vatican II papal encyclicals? This is a huge stumbling block for me accepting sedevacantism. And so his response when I was talking about this is it doesn't seem... because my point of view is that if sedevacantism is true, it needs to be as true as night and day. It can't be murky. And when I told him it was murky, he was basically saying that, a lot of sedevacantists, that God just gives them grace to see that sedevacantism is true. And maybe I'm sounding like a Pelagian when I say that doesn't cut it for me, but it doesn't, because the regular Catholic Church is a visible body you can point to. Sedevacantism is not a visible body. And I know that I might have took him out of context a little, but the point stands that sedevacantism is primarily shaped by an emotion of disgust to scandals, rather than any deep reading of contradictions. And there are contradictions before and after the council. Because sedevacantism is emotionally driven by scandals, that means that Pope Francis, having more scandals than John the 23rd through Benedict combined, possibly by an order of magnitude, has been the greatest miracle grow in the history of sedevacantism. They're seeing explosive growth. I remember right before Pope Francis became Pope, there was this True Restoration interview with the Father Michael Oswald, who was a diocesan priest who left the regular church to join the CMRI. And in that interview, Stephen Heiner goes head over heels talking about you're the first so-called Novus Ordo priest to defect to sedevacantism, right? It was such a big deal that you had this one priest defecting, ordained normal priest defecting to become a Tukite CMRI priest, right? That lack of credibility meant that, diocesan priests who left the diocese to become traditionalists, they would join the Society of St. Pius X, or they would get, conditionally reordained by the society, and then find some lay people to form a church that was independent of the main body of the church. But they didn't buy into sedevacantism. They would just buy into this independent Latin Mass thing. But more and more, diocesan priests are joining them. There's this uptick if you watch these Bishop Sanborn seminary videos or these CMRI videos. There's I don't want to say it, but Novus Ordo priests that are getting reordained with Tukite orders, right? Or maybe that's too scandalous to say the word Tukite, but they're becoming these sedevacantist, questionable priests. Um, and if you get to the point where you have a consecrated bishop who held control of a diocese joining in with the sedevacantist, that is a sea change. That is a traumatic change that we're not going to be able to go back to. The level of bragging that you would see when that one priest joined the CMRI, that would be so minuscule compared to just a single diocesan priest becoming a sedevacantist. And every single time that Francis pushes the envelope a little bit more, he's making that possibility more and more of a reality. And so when you see somebody like Archbishop Vigano, he was, an Orthodox bishop. He was a good bishop, but he was practicing sort of liturgy. So was Strickland. And when they cross paths with Francis's scandals, they're Lefebvrist, right? They jump all the way over. There's no transition for these people. And that's really interesting. They don't go through this phase of being a conservative reform of the reform. And they don't keep loyal to John Paul II and Benedict XVI's theology and then do the Latin Mass. No, they're just jumping full bore into Lefebvrism. And, maybe they're not as anti-John Paul II as Lefebvre was. But they're making just as radical statements as Lefebvre or Bishop Castro de Meyer. And, maybe this reform, the reform mindset, and the conservative Novus Ordo thing, that was just not going to stand on its own. It was some kind of transitional thing that could only exist with the support of those popes. Most of the Orthodox Catholics, right, they don't know any better. They're thirsting for the full tradition, right? They're drinking some kind of Coors Light and they're going to get, a good tasting real beer, and that's full traditionalism. Maybe that's what's going on. Or maybe even Vigano, Strickland, Schneider, these people jump into Lefebvrism because they're just playing the card that they get. And that being an enemy of Francis or being critical of Francis or being kicked out by Francis means that you have the card of being a traditionalist, and they jump on board with that viewpoint. But then again, it seems that all kinds of people amongst the spectrum of what I would call Orthodox Catholicism, that is, they believe that the Catholic Church is the true church found by Jesus Christ. They believe in the real presence. They believe, gay marriage is wrong, abortion is wrong, there can never be female priests. That type of Catholic, the EWTN crowd, the conservative Novus Ordo crowd, the faithful Novus Ordo crowd that might even go to the guitar masses, they're becoming increasingly critical of Francis. And this distinction and this animosity that would have existed between traditionalism in the shadows, whether in the indult or not sedevacantism, the Society of St. Pius X, and going back and forth between those two, and the more like Orthodox crowd, the Scott Hahns and the EWTN crowd and the Catholic Answers crowd, the walls that existed are falling down between those groups. That's not a good sign if you're Francis. Francis has broken down those walls and he's creating some kind of pan-Orthodox coalition, when beforehand there was a lot of people that were going to the Orthodox, or that were held completely Orthodox views, that went to the Novus Ordo, that would not have touched the Latin Mass or the 10-foot pole. Those people are turning on Francis. And this is kind of a parallel thing, and maybe this will be a little bit scandalous, but I know a a little bit about the history of continuing Anglicanism. I've read books about it. And the problem when the Anglican Church started to go off the rails in the 70s was because you had all these low church firebrands and these more level-headed high churchmen. They would not work together to try and fight off modernism, and so modernism conquered the American Episcopal Church and the Church of England. And so, Lord, forgive me for that analogy, but in our case, the Catholics, the high churchmen, they're the firebrands, the traditionalists. And now they're working with, our equivalent of the low churchmen, right? And that are more level-headed. But they're working together a lot better than the Anglicans did in similar circumstances. All this being said, Bishop Strickland flirting with sedevacantism, that's setting an extremely dangerous precedent for Francis. The clerics he is angering are not just loyal to the worldview of the previous pope and keeping quiet. They're jumping full head first into SSPX and Campos territory. And a lot of them are pushing past it. Cardinal Mueller just said that Francis has said material heresies. He was created cardinal by Francis. And he was cardinal until he was sacked by Francis. When he was cardinal, he was the head of the successor to the Inquisition. He's now going as hard, if not harder, than Lefebvre did. Cardinal Mueller and Cardinal Burke have the most authority of anyone in the whole entire church to criticize Francis. And they're doing that. They also are heavyweights for any future sedevacantism against Francis, especially benevacantism. Because if it starts to spread amongst the episcopacy, that is cancer that could kill Francis's papacy. Just because Mueller and Burke don't jump on board with benevacantism doesn't mean that they don't help it with those statements. Because these lower level bishops like Strickland, if they adopted benevacantism, they could still use the authority of Mueller and Burke to push for benevacantism. Now, when you have somebody like Father Altman pushing benevacantism, it's bad. Because the laity are going to pick up on it, and possibly other priests are going to pick up on it. But it's a whole nother level of bad if you have a sitting bishop that buys into it. Because then, those sitting bishops, they could bring back councilorism. They could form rival synods and possibly elect their own pope. There's a reason historically that popes didn't resign, and cardinals would tell them not to resign. The successor's legitimacy ends up being questioned if there's two popes. And historically, resigning popes would end up becoming hostages of people trying to put them back on the throne for their own worldly gain. And so, Benedict XVI's resignation, I think, is a better rallying cry than the whole Vatican II defected the church, because it really just goes on the authority of who was there with Benedict XVI, who was his close confidants. And I don't have access to them. I have access to the documents of Vatican II. I have access to Paul VI and John Paul II's encyclicals, right? I can, it's muddy as heck. And because it's muddy as heck, if I'm going to try and see if they contradict stuff, that's really hard. But the question if Francis validly succeeded Benedict XVI, I have to go solely upon the words of the people that were with Benedict when he resigned and lived with him. That is solely on their authority. So I think that's a much easier pill to swallow than full-bore sedevacantism. So if Francis or a successor like him keeps knocking off dissident bishops and causing widespread scandals, they face the possibility of a synod, not just individual bishops, being a fraternal correction to this. So imagine this. The synodal way keeps going on every 2 years or few years, however it's going. But then there's all these dismissed bishops or dissident bishops, right? And they go and they make their own synod at the same time in opposition. And they rebuke everything that the synod, the official synod under Francis or his successor, says. Then you basically have a Catholic GAFCOM, the Anglican order, or the Anglican group of bishops and primates that was correcting the Bishop of Canterbury, and have now effectively cut off his authority, broke off, and took the vast majority of the Anglican body with them. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the better things that could happen. Ultimately, they could have a council, the Sedevacantists in perfect council, and they could elect popes. There could be multiple popes again, just like the Great Western Schism. Now, this might seem pretty radical and extreme for me to say this. Now, look out of the window and see what's going on in the two other biggest bodies of Christianity. In Eastern Orthodoxy, the Patriarch of Russia and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople cut each other off, and Orthodoxy split in two in 2018, right? And as I just said with GAFCOM, the body, the vast majority of national conferences for the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church, they basically cut off the Archbishop of Canterbury's authority and separated the Anglican Communion. And going back to this Anglican parallel, right? When you read about continuing Anglicanism, you see that all these priests, they're eccentric, they're hotheads, they're radical, renegade priests, and that's where continuing Anglicanism comes from. And they suffer from a credibility problem in that movement. But there's a more respectful movement that came later, the Anglican Realignment movement, which seems ascendant and will be ultimately subsumed Anglicanism, it seems at this point, right? And so I see a parallel there. You have the original Sedevacantism after Vatican II. And now this anti-Francis rising, this movement of Benevacantism, or Cardinal Mueller saying that Francis is a material heretic, they have a lot better respectability. They're like the more respectable Anglican Realignment that came decades later. The papacy needs to see this reality before it's too late. If Francis and his successor continues with this direction, they're only playing with fire. It's playing with a fire that consumed the two other biggest immediate branches of Christianity. If things continue down this route with what's going on in Germany, and Francis shrewdly failing to address criticisms like the dubia, and his indifference to doctrine, then the possibility of a massive schism with multiple popes becomes ever more likely in the near future.